Welcome, Eve. I'm so happy to talk to you today. I'd like to discuss the connection between storytelling and survival. You know, anthropologists call us Homo narrans, the storytelling ape, and they point to the evolutionary connection between storytelling and human survival. I'd like to start by asking you, how has story operated in your own life as a tool for survival as well as self-knowledge?
Wow, that's a great question and a huge question. And I was actually thinking a lot about, because I'm reading a lot of books right now on pagan culture, prehistoric culture, and how storytelling was really in some ways what distinguished human beings and allowed us to both have a way of foretelling and imagining and conceiving the future through storytelling, as well as having an awareness of ourselves in the present tense. I think for me, where I've always been connected to storytelling is that I think sometimes when you're in the midst of violence or trauma or difficulty, you can lose your way and you can lose your perspective and you can become numb and you can become separated from yourself. And I think one of the things that storytelling does is it gives you a perspective. It begins to carve out a way of making sense of what's going on in your situation, but it also gives you a voice in a situation where you may be voiceless, or gives you some inkling of power in a situation where you may be powerless. I think it also, for me, the best reason to tell stories is that they encourage, inspire, catalyze imagination. And I think if we are short of anything right now in the times that we're living in, because everything has become so highly mechanized, because, you know, we are so distrustful of myth and so distrustful of storytelling and the belief that the rational logic is the triumph. I mean, we are so deeply in need of imagination. And I think what stories do is they catalyze those muscles which propel the imagination.
And why do you think we're so distrustful of myth?
Well, I think it's ever since Socrates, ever since the kind of rational intelligence became dominant, there is such an inherent trust in people that somehow myths or stories or poetic understanding of the world or paradox or ambiguity is somehow a lesser form of intelligence. And I actually think that in the times that we're living in, I mean, in point of fact, it is science and technology and rational logic that brought us here to a large degree. So I think we need to really question deeply what rational intelligence has done for us. But I would argue, and this is something I've really been seeing in a lot of reading that I've been doing lately, that everything associated with, or a lot associated with myth, or a lot associated with storytelling, was associated with actually the earth and with women and with another culture, because so much of how people communicated, the story of the earth and the movings of the earth and the way the earth operated were the stories that were told to both make sense of the earth, but to cherish the earth, to honor the earth, to celebrate the earth, to create rituals that would give thanks to the earth. And I think once that kind of separation happened between the mind and the spirit, between the body and the mind, which happened, I think, through patriarchal dominance, I think then storytelling and myth-making were forced into the underground. I mean, into the, quote, unconscious. Like things just got pushed to the bottom rather than being part of the world, the everyday world. And I think in a way the reverse has to happen now. We have to rely on storytelling. We have to rely on myth-making. We have to rely on our intuitions and our premonitions and our visions, because I think actually they will be what can, if anything, they will be what guides us out of this really, really destructive period.
And in your own life, Eve, how was discovering your voice as a writer and your ability to tell story connected to how you survived the difficulties and the confusions that you came through?
Well, I think that whenever you're in a situation where somebody has power over you, where there's a tyranny, whether it's racism or sexism or classism, or in your own family where there is the dominant father who makes up everybody's opinion and tells everybody how they will think and how they will behave, obviously I think you begin to lose your ability to exist outside that structure, and you begin to dissolve into that structure. And I think for me at a very young age, I remember having a journal and a book where after terrible things would happen in my family, I would go and I would write and I would tell stories and I would make up things and I would invent things. It was almost as if like to kind of crystallize that persona or to make that persona into something concrete on page was keeping some alternative voice, alternative self in me alive. And it's so interesting because I was reading a lot of Jung recently in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, where he actually talks about his two selves, you know, one that existed in the shadow self, one that existed in the light. And I think for me, storytelling was a way of actualizing a part of me that was being disappeared through violence and through domination.
And over the years, as you've told your story in different forms, has your version of yourself also evolved?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think hopefully I've told my story, but I've also told stories that I've both heard and imagined, of other women. And I think in the process of that, I think one of the great things about storytelling is we can imagine another story, right? Mm-hmm. I think all of us get born into a particular story. Like, this is your story. This is going to be the story of your life, right? You were born and you were abused and you were blah, blah, blah. And now you're going to have this particular life trajectory, which is your story. But when we actually tell stories, we discover fairly quickly that stories are valuable. Stories are not fixed. Stories are not absolute. Somebody made it up, right? First, right. Now you get to make it up now. I've been working a lot on the Adam and Eve myth, which was a myth, in fact. It was somebody told that story, and then a lot of people bought into that story, and then there was a lot of, energy around that story. But in fact, it is a story. And I think there is something about the authority that we project onto stories, right? We give them this authority, but we're giving them that in our own lives and in the collective stories that get told. And what I'm seeing more and more is that we get to make the stories up. We get to change the stories. We get to transform the stories. And it's up to us to do that. Nothing is fixed. Nothing's hardened. Nothing's a given. Like, the only givens are what we accept as givens. And I think when you write stories and create stories, you realize the malleability. You realize that we are the engineers of our own stories. We get to make stuff up. And particularly making stories up that serve the interest of the greater good. There are many myths that have just outworn their welcome, that are no longer serving us. They never did serve us, but they're so transparently and so obviously no longer serving us. And part of what we have to do, I think, in this time is be brave storytellers, be courageous myth makers, where we say, no, here's the new myth we're writing. Here's the new story we're telling, which has a lot to do at the bottom of it with our survival, because we can only travel as far as our stories travel, right? We can't go past the parameters of our stories, And so what we have to do now is expand those parameters to much more transcendent places, I think, much more transformative places, and not be locked in by the patriarchal stories, racist stories, classist stories, stories where we already know the outcomes, right? We're already acting out the outcomes.
I love that, that we can only travel as far as our stories travel. I mean, that makes complete sense. Viktor Frankl said that suffering minus meaning equals despair. And I'm wondering, how does storytelling connect to the creation of meaning, do you think, in our personal life and also in our cultural life?
Well, I think again, it's fascinating because it is the story, right? It is the story of a fallen world where everything that happens to humanity is doomed and finished from the beginning, so that we have to turn our wills over to some God who's going to hopefully save us in the next world, right? Or is this a world where we're actually living in divinity and we have enormous choice over, like, cherishing and creating and imagining this world that we want to live in? And in fact, we haven't been born into hell. Now, one story gives me a lot of despair, right? That first story just feels very despairing to me, like the fact that we're born into hell that we're doomed as human beings, that we can't ever evolve, that, you know, that only like this higher God can save us, blah, blah, blah. I feel like we have to start creating stories that give our lives meaning. And part of that is, again, up to us. Like, I think we've so long turned our stories over, right, to those in power, right, who have actually kind of sunk us with meaning and made us greatly despaired, right? Even the story of climate crisis, we can look at it so many different ways. I mean, every other day I feel like I'm creating another story, right? You know, on one particular day it's we have time and we can begin to recreate a world where we're living in much more interconnectedness and oneness, where growth and consumption is not the modality, we're taking care of each other. Okay, and then other days the story is it's past that. We're already done. We should just prepare for how we're going to leave this world. Now, I don't know which story is true. Nobody does, right? So it seems to me, on any given day, which story is going to make my life have more meaning, which is going to make me be more committed to the struggle, which is going to make me be more loving, which is going to make me work harder to save the planet. I mean, I'll choose the first story. You know what I mean? Because now, and it may be wrong, and it may be that we are past the point, and we already have destroyed our future, that, you know, that there is way too much carbon released and that the fossil fuels will never end. But that story gives my life less meaning. Do you know what I mean? It just feels bad. And to some degree, all stories are stories. I mean, we're making this up as we go along, right? So why not create a story that's going to motivate you and inspire you, it seems to me, or at least fill you with some kind of possibility to continue on, even if you're deluding yourself, you know?
Right. And then I think is a hard thing for people because they're trying to figure out which story is true, and making the story's power dependent on whether or not it's true. And I think a lot of people lose the opportunity to pick and choose and to shape their own version of things. You know, understanding that story is something, like you're saying, it's always changing. You know, it doesn't have to be the absolute truth to be a tool.
Exactly. And what is true? I mean, like, I'll give you an example. Like, when I went through chemotherapy, I got a frame for that from my friend Sue, where she said, okay, this chemo is going to burn away everything that needs to be burned away in your past, in your, you know, in your stories, in the violence in your past, everything that went on with your father, every violent story you heard about rape. I like that story. That story works for me. Okay? Now, I don't know if that's a true story, but you know what? I went into this experience with a deep belief in that possibility of that story. And you know what? It actually changed me. So there's also how much of the story and the belief in the story is actually writing the story. Do you know? How much is our commitment to a story making the story actually come alive? And I think about that often, you know, like how many times in my life I've seen people who, like, for example, two different people who get cancer. One person says, this is the end, I'm finished. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I am hopeless, I'm helpless, I can't get out of this. And they don't want to release that story. And another person who goes, you know what, I'm going to fight this. I see this as a transformative experience. This is going to take me down to the bottom of my soul, and I'm going to get to wrestle with demons whether I live or die, and I'm going to get closer to my dharma, you know what I mean? And they have completely different outcomes, even if they both end up getting well or if they both end up dying. There are different outcomes. And I think so often, you know, the stories we tell are an act, are art. I guess that's the way I put it. Like, constructing a story is art. It's not only the architecture of where you're going, but it's the highway, you know? So we heal, we imagine ourselves forward through story, and we can choose which direction, which kind of a route we want to take. Is that what you're saying? I think so. And look, often it may not always work out the way we've told our story, but my experience is, and this is definitely my experience, is that when I write a story and fully give myself to that story, often the story happens. If I say, for example, I am doomed in love, right? Like, these are the pieces, blah, blah, blah. Like, guess what? The chances are good I'm doomed in love. You know, like, write ourselves into things. And I'm not being Pollyanna to think that there aren't systems like neoliberal capitalism or racism or patriarchy that don't oppress people. Like, I'm not saying, like, you can write yourself out of those systems. But I think you can write yourself into having power in those systems, having resistance in those systems, having a vision for another system that you can fight for. You know what I mean? And I think those stories are really important.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about is the difference between healing and curing. You know, we can't always cure the disease, whether the disease is cancer or patriarchy in a given situation. But we can heal within the context of those given circumstances by becoming more whole and aware and connected with our truth.
I think one of the problems with the stories already written are they are always disempowering the people. Do you know what I mean? Always stories where the marginalized or the people not in power lose, right? So part of it is how do we write the new stories where we triumph, where people come together, where all of those supposed givens are under massive question. I think that's really what has to happen right now is that authority has to be under massive in every respect, and we just can't accept anything as a given.
Right. How do you think having a spiritual perspective on oneself and the world affects the kind of stories that we tell and the reach of our stories?
It's such a complicated word, spiritual. I mean, it means so much to so many different people.
What does it mean to you?
You know, I was reading something very interesting in this really brilliant book on the great cosmic mother. And she said something really interesting about Marx that I found really compelling. She was just talking about how Marxism absolutely made a brilliant, obviously, strategy for economics and for well-being and for connecting, you know, for how people can live. But because it was so profoundly separated and consciously separated and obsessively separated from the spirit, right, it never engaged people or the amount of people or the depth of people the way it could have. And she was just talking about in this particular section, the New Age has gone one direction by making everything spiritual and individual and you know, transcendent, and the political world has gone the other direction by making everything literal and point to point to point, but cutting it off almost from the spirit in embarrassment, you know? And I think the next evolving, I think it's in a mystical politics that is evolving, a way in which we bring these forces together. I think this separation of the spirit and the mind, or the spirit and the body, has been the most oppressive separation. And I think as women, we've always known that separation has been deadly. And I think we're evolving into a time where the spirit can't be separated. I think it's so interesting, even looking at the Pope right now, about climate change as a spiritual issue or a moral issue, you know? We have to look at the spiritual dimensions of it as well as the political dimensions of it, as well as the psychological and emotional dimensions. Like, it has to be integrated now. One of the things I'm really struck by spending the summer here in such a beautiful, gorgeous, natural environment is how the spirit is imbued in everything that is nature, you know? And how once we cut off from nature, once that separation initially occurred, where nature was seen as a fallen place, and a place that we had to have dominion over. I think if you just spend watching a flock of birds, or watching them bathe from a pond, or watching high grass blow in the wind, or stars, or night, you know, that twilight hour, you absolutely know that nature is imbued with great spirit. And I think that horrible separation is what we have to heal right now, so that that spirit comes into everything, you know, and the mind comes into everything, and that we're whole beings.
Right. You're saying that spirit is a part of everything we do, and when we see spirit as separate, that's when it becomes this kind of newfangled, new agey thing. But when you see it as an integral part of what's actually animating creation, and animating us and connecting us, then storytelling becomes a holistic.
Yes, and if I look at like 1 Billion Rising, for example, there were stories getting told all over the world that were being told through the body, right? Like the dancing body, which was such a combination of people resisting certain forces in the world, whether they be oppression of migrant workers or rape of domestic workers or rape of the earth, but they were expressing it through the storytelling that was really going on in their bodies. And that was of the spirit. It was of the heart. It was of fierce resistance. It was of revolution. But it was like coming from both a very transcendent place and a very practical place at the same time, Yeah.
Well, isn't that what women are all about? I mean, aren't women the vehicles of the transcendent coming into the body and connecting us to the earth?
I was reading this thing the other day which says females are constructed, the female anatomy and biology is constructed as a bridge between these worlds, you know what I mean? And it was the severing, it was the cutting off of this that cut off our ability to bring these worlds together. And I think there are many women who understand now that we are coming into a time where we have to honor what we know, have to stand behind what we know and the way we know things and trust our intuition. I read a great article this morning that just said something like, why is it that women get for being emotional? It's men's emotions that have brought us here. And I think it's so true. If you look at war, right, that has to do with intuition, that has to do with and I think we have been told not to trust those ways of knowing. We've been told not to trust the ways of storytelling. We've been told not to trust the ways of myth-making. Higher logic out there that prevails. And I think this is a time where we have to come back into our bodies and trust our bodies, trust the way our bodies know things, trust the way our bodies feel things,
Well, men are terrified of what women know, and men are scared of women's stories.
Yes, it does seem like historically that is proved to be true. I think in a way men are scared not to know. I think we have to give permission to everybody to not know, to be lost, to not have to have the past, to not have to create the way. I think what patriarchy did is it created such a tyranny for men that if they didn't know the answer, if they didn't know the way, if they didn't know what was going on, if they couldn't direct things and control things, they were failures. And I think there's so many men who are oppressed by that tyranny. And I think part of it is, it's kind of this very paradoxical thing. We all have to be lost together right now, and we all have to imagine, go into the depths of our imaginations right now. But we all have to be lost together. Somebody can't be pretending they know what's going on. That's the problem, because when you pretend you know what's going on, then you're at some hierarchically above level, even though you have no idea what you're talking about. And we all just have to be in this big mess together where we get to say, you know what, we're lost. So now lost, how do we put our most imaginative energies, evolution of the next consciousness that needs to evolve for humanity to continue? And to me, that's all we should be thinking about, what is the next evolutionary consciousness that needs to happen? And the only way there that I know of is through storytelling. We have to be able to picture it. We have to be able to see it. We have to be able to imagine it. Because if we can't see where we're going, I don't know how we get there.
No, and if we can't tell the truth about where we are, we can't possibly begin in a way that's effective. And that means, like you're saying, admitting that we don't know. And that brings me to my last question for you, and it's about telling the truth. Because we rarely tell the whole truth, either about ourselves or about the world. And yet without doing that, we can't change. So what do you say to people who believe that it's sort of best to leave the past behind us rather than examine our pains and losses and question the value of truth-telling as a part of spiritual survival?
Here's what I think. I don't think there's any way forward without telling the truth on the past and getting as close to the truth as we can. And we know the truth is always evading us the closer we get to it, But I will say, I think all we have to do right now is look at the story of race in America. All we have to do is look at the fact that 9 churches have been burned since the horrible, horrible shooting in Charleston. And look at the fact that racism is still there at the core of this country. And you can trace it back to the death of Martin Luther King, to Malcolm X, you can trace it back to the silencing of the story. It just went underground. It stopped being talked about. There stopped being a dialogue. We stopped dealing with all the layers of racism, all the tentacles of racism, all the ways we would have to kind of decolonize ourselves, each and every one of us, to live in a world where we would be, racist free. And I think that's a perfect example of, like, do we know our history? Do we know what happened in this country? How many people died, indigenous people died for this country to be born? Or how many slaves were brought here? What happened to the slaves? How do we possibly move forward without an understanding of what people have survived in their DNA, what collective story is running through their system of suffering and oppression? And that's just one example. But I know for me, like in my own personal life, there was no way of moving forward without moving back. There was no way. And I think the story of America is the story of amnesia. I remember when Ronald Reagan died, and people were mourning him and weeping for him. And I was like, are you kidding? Do we remember what Ronald Reagan did to this country? And it was as if that had never happened. It was as if, and I think one of the deadliest disorders we have in America is amnesia, that we don't hold our memories, that we don't honor our dead, that we don't think of and honor and cherish those who've been oppressed and enslaved and died for things, and that we don't bring them into everything we do every day of our lives, that somehow they're separated. Again, that separation,
And that happens, I think, in the name of survival. People think, well, we just have to keep moving forward and not look back. And of course, that just leads to repeating the mistakes of the past. So,
but I think that's always related to, Mark, people's notion of security, and people's notion of survival is security. And I just have a few things to say about security. Like, security is not the panacea. It's not what we're doing here. We're not here to become secure. That isn't the point of our lives. There is no security. We're going to die. Okay? At the end of this whole story is a whole other story we know nothing about. Okay? And that's the big story that's coming. And so it seems to me that if our story that we were telling ourselves were not laced on the contingency of security, but were laced, for example, on the contingency of connection or care, or compassion, then we would be interested in the past. Then we would be interested in where people come from and what hurts people and what sufferings people have been engaged in that bring them to the present tense. But as long as we stay hooked on this security notion, which is completely illusory, and also juvenile, I think, to some degree, when we know straight up that it's not going to happen.
Thank you so much, Eve, and it's been great to talk to Eve Ensler today, and I hope all of you enjoy our conversation. Thanks a lot.